Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Book Trek 2023, the Summer of Trek, an event created by Vin at Revenant Reads. He's assembled a bunch of co-hosts, and we are talking Star Trek fiction all summer long. They aren't talking Star Trek fiction at quite the frequency that I am, but I don't know how long my frequency is going to last. This video will not be long, not because I didn't love the book that I'm talking about, but because as will sometimes happen, a deadline that I thought was Monday a week from now is actually Monday tomorrow. So I've got suddenly a large amount of work that I need to get done today. And also, I've got a huge project that is looming over me this summer, just in general, that I've been picking and pecking at when I should be doing a huge chunk of work every day. The deadline is in the third week of August, and I know that. And I keep telling myself, oh, it's the third week of August. It's forever away. It's not forever away. Not at all. So, even though I said this will be a short video, it probably won't be. Well, I'll try. I'll do my best. Nevertheless, I've been reading Star Trek from the beginning. I've been watching Star Trek from the beginning, caring about it from the beginning. So I was very happy to be a co-host again this year for Book Trek. And the last Star Trek book that we talked about was The Brave and the Bold Part 1 by Keith DeCandido, which is a very interesting concept built around a very overused MacGuffin, and the ancient dead civilization, the ancient mysterious artifact that is basically magic, that sort of thing. That happens a lot. That happens a lot on Star Trek. And in this case, the ancient civilization is the Zalkat Union. As Jonathan Archer in the first book refers to it as the Alley Cat Union. That was huge. It was sprawling, much bigger than the Federation. And flourished and disappeared 90,000 years ago. So long before most civilizations in the Federation existed, long before a lot of the species in the Federation existed, 90,000 years ago, which provoked me to a long and tedious discussion about the Fermi paradox last time. I'll try not to do that again this time. And not only the Zalkat Union, but specifically Malchus the Mighty, a particular ruler that the fragmentary legends that our present day characters unearth in The Brave and the Bold Part 1 indicates ruled for 1,000 years and had all sorts of incredible powers. And those powers are centered around four MacGuffins, four items, four mysterious boxes that allow their possessor, through some sort of telepathic communication, the boxes seem to be semi-sentient. And through some sort of telepathic communication, they allow their possessor to do certain things. And there are four of them, and when the Zalkat Union evaporated and when Malchus the Mighty finally fell, those four items were scattered to far distant corners of the domains of the Zalkatians and hidden. And they've stayed hidden for 90,000 years. And they allow you to, in the first book we saw, they allow you to inflict a virus. You can sicken people. Not in the normal way. You can cause the virus to happen. That's one of the things. And the other thing that we saw in the first book is a directed energy beam, an enormously powerful laser. And in the first book, we see the idea that Keith DeCandido has here, which is that all of those artifacts will be found relatively at the same time. Certainly, chronologically speaking, relatively at the same moment. They'll maybe a century apart, 2 centuries apart, but in terms of 90,000 years, it'll be like they were all found at the same moment. That's a bit of a coincidence, that coincidence is compounded by the fact that these things are all found by people who know people who know people that we know. In other words, Keith DeCandido wants to write a sprawling story that involves as many aspects of the Star Trek canonical franchises as possible, in which established characters have to deal with these rediscovered artifacts. What would they do if they fell into the wrong hands, as they inevitably will? Now, we're going to talk about what constitutes the right and wrong hands later on in this very short video. but for now, when part 1 ended, we've only dealt with 2 artifacts at the end of part 1. Part 2 is obviously going to be the next 2 artifacts. And I loved part 1. Absolutely loved it. It was a different kind of Star Trek. It was our marquee characters were not marquee. We'll be getting to the marquee. Our big name characters were definitely involved, but sometimes earlier than we really know them, or in adventures that we didn't really ever see, or as side characters to other canonical characters who are minor, which is a big deal. That is, if you do that well, that is wonderful. That's what fan fiction for Star Trek used to be all about. Find some minor character, Dr. Miranda Jones, or well, I don't even know, Surak, the ancient Vulcan philosopher. Find some character that appeared only once on a show and flesh them out. Give them all sorts of adventures of their own. That used to be very popular in Star Trek fan fiction, and a little bit of that, I think, carries over, although I'd be willing to bet that Keith DeCandido is too young to remember those original years of Star Trek fiction. Because in that first book, we get a wonderful look at Commodore Matt Decker, for instance, who has an amazing turn. He's an extremely memorable character in one episode of the original series. And the same thing is true in the Benjamin Sisko segment of that first book. And I don't know, in yesterday's video, I sort of toyed with the idea that although I loved part 1, maybe I wouldn't move on straight to part 2, but I couldn't resist. So I moved on straight to part 2. And this cover is misleading. Understandably so. This cover is misleading because if the cover actually featured the characters who are the main characters in these stories, the general reader wouldn't recognize them. Now, I don't understand why that is so, because these books aren't for the general reader. And any Star Trek fan would recognize pretty much any character that you put up on the screen. I'm sure that you Star Trek fans out there recognize at least 3 of these 4 characters. Klingons all tend to look alike. Cancelled. No, they don't. But this is the next 2 fragments. And they aren't being found centuries apart anymore. They're being found, on Tuesday and then on Thursday, in order to involve all of our main characters. They have to do that, and also to draw into the story a character who, when she first appears in the first book, seems like a weird intrusion out of nowhere. And in the first part of the first book, when this character appears, her name is Idulak, and she's referred to as a siren, a group of spacefaring beings that can lure men to do things against their own will. She seems to appear out of nowhere in the first part of part 1, and I confess, I thought, well, okay, you just thought that was a neat idea, and you threw that in? Why on earth? I should have had more trust in this author. This author knows what he's doing, and I didn't. That character grows in importance as each of these segments unfolds, and in part 2 we really get to see how important Idulak is, how important, and how the term siren is such a small rendition of what this character is. It turns out that this character, Idulak, is very much connected to the Zalkat Union and to Malchus the Mighty, very much connected to these 4 artifacts. But before we get the resolution of that at the end of this book, that aspect, Malchus the Mighty, and what these artifacts are, really what they are, not just what they can do, but what they are, and Idulak, the character. That aspect in these 2 books is very much what a book like this, what a series like this needs, and that is a through line of its own, as opposed to fan service and member berries and key jingling or whatever the alt-right fascists call it on YouTube now these days. You need a through line of your own. You need a story of your own. It can't be just that you find a MacGuffin and the story is all the havoc that the MacGuffin wreaks in your life until you figure out how to deal with it. No, the MacGuffin itself has to have a story. And lots of Star Trek stories that want to link various franchises like this forget that point. They just forget that point. This one doesn't. And it's very, very satisfying. Part 2 was even better than part one, which is saying something, because I thought part one was terrific. What I wouldn't give for a big trade paperback. These aren't long books. You could put the two of them together in one book easily. What I wouldn't give for that. Maybe get, throw a little money Keith Candido's way. Get him to write a preface set in the time of the Salkat Union involving Malchus the Mighty. He could do that without spoiling the big revelations that come in this book about the Union and about Malchus the Mighty, and then maybe an epilogue. That would be great if he did that. And then reprint all four of these parts. But the first part of this, the one at the top of the banner instead of the bottom, involves the finding of another one of these items. And it's found by an Andorian named Tharia, who is a member of the Maquis, this resistance group that we've talked about in Book Trek so far. And we'll talk about it again. It's a very fascinating subject. It would be just a footnote if it weren't that Maquis members keep cropping up as long-standing iconic characters in the mainstream franchise shows. That means you have to sort of deal with their past as terrorists. I mean, the Federation and the Cardassians consider them to be terrorists. They are fighting to get any Cardassian influence out of the planets along the demilitarized zone, the DMZ. They don't believe there should be a DMZ. This is just a treaty that two governments made, and we don't agree with it. It's fundamentally unjust. We will war against the Cardassians until they are gone from every inch of the soil of every one of these planets that don't belong to them. Unfortunately, that conflicts with Federation policy. Even though the Federations are no friends of the Romulans or the Cardassians, they still want peace. And so the Federation is kind of tasked with hunting the Maquis, even though a number of Federation people, including some Federation officers, have joined the Maquis out of a sense of outraged conscience. And we get all of that. All of that is brought into the first part of this book, just wonderfully brought into the first part of this book, where this Maquis Andorian, acting out of grief, he has lost his family. He goes to a Cardassian outpost and uses the artifact that he has found to bring about devastating weather. Massive lightning bolts, melting ice caps, crippling storms, so that the governor of that Cardassian outpost has to ask the Cardassian Empire to evacuate the planet. These aren't just minor storms they can batten down the hatches. These will kill everything on the planet. He asks Gulliver, who we've seen a few times in Star Trek. If you're paying real close attention, you will remember Gulliver. Talk about all looking the same. He asks Gulliver to evacuate his colony. And the Federation is tasked with investigating. And that investigation does not fall to Jean-Luc Picard. There he is, right on the cover of Big as Life, but it doesn't fall to him. It falls to Captain De Soto of the Hood, who we've met a few times in just, brief little cameos in canonical Star Trek as an old friend of Jean-Luc Picard's, as an old friend of Benjamin Sisko. He's a regular, recurring name throughout Star Trek. We don't know much about him. We don't know much about the adventures of the Hood. But Captain De Soto is involved in the Dominion War. His name comes up in shows. He's one of those things that lurks in the back of our consciousness when you are a longtime Star Trek fan, is that you know that Kirk's not the only captain having adventures. You know that. And we get tantalizing glimpses here and there. At least with Captain De Soto, we get to see him. With Admiral Hastur, for instance, in Deep Space Nine, we don't. We get his name a few times, and we know that he's a hard-charging figure, but we never even see him. Same thing with Captain Asimov. We don't ever see him. We don't ever know anything about him at all, except for fan speculation. But these captains are out there. These big ones are out there, and De Soto is a big one, and he has to help with the Maquis. He has to help with figuring out what's going on here, and there's a way to do that. He confers with, first of all, he's drawn into an SOS by another Starfleet vessel, Voyager, which has had a shakedown cruise. Not its maiden cruise, the one that we see interrupted in the first episode of Star Trek Voyager, but its shakedown cruise. And everything's gone wrong, to the point where the ship is crippled. Some of you may remember in the early years of Star Trek Voyager, we're told that it had neurogel packs built into the ship to help with the speed of information relay and whatnot. It was always kind of a dodgy concept. Voyager largely abandons it after 2 or 3 seasons. But here, it's the gel packs that actually malfunction. In their first real strong warp speed field test, they malfunction. They go wrong in a catastrophic way, so that there's no loss of life, but Voyager needs the Hood's help in order to get going again. So Voyager is there. Captain Janeway is there. All of the Voyager crew is there. Keep in mind, the original Voyager crew. So when Janeway says, "This is my chief engineer," every Voyager fan is going to think B'Elanna Torres. And it's not. She's introducing the chief engineer who dies in the first episode of Voyager. Same thing with her number one, her executive officer. Dies on the bridge of Voyager. We see him die in the first episode. But they're alive and well. In this episode, they're alive and well. And Janeway is pretty sure that she knows what her Starfleet career is going to be like. And it's not going to involve getting catapulted to the Delta Quadrant. That's nowhere in anybody's thinking. Instead, she's pretty sure that she's going to patrol the Badlands, where the Maquis are mostly located, deal with them. And Captain DeSoto is happy to help. He makes an offhand mental comment about how he supposes that Voyager is a good ship, but he wishes it didn't look like a garden spade. I took that personally. And they figure out a way. Voyager can't do anything. Voyager can't help with this adventure. Voyager's people can, to a certain extent, but Voyager can't. Voyager is the Hood is helping Voyager to get back underway. But one of the people on board Voyager has an idea. Some of you Voyager fans will know already. This is the story of how Tuvok infiltrates the Maquis crew of Chakotay. And B'Elanna Torres and Seska and Mr. Suter, they're all in here. All those characters from the first episode of Voyager are in here. Only this is a story of how Tuvok infiltrates that crew. And it's really well done. Really, really well done. It's a little bit too easy, considering, I mean, as I've mentioned many times before, Star Trek novels are a product of their time. Most especially including their tech. Which we think would be the least vulnerable thing, because it's hundreds of years in the future, so you can just make up whatever you want. But nope, they're always a reflection of their tech. The earliest Star Trek novels, I mean the ones from, the 1970s, in the Federation, there's no such thing. There's not even an awareness that there could be such a thing as, for instance, the internet, much less holographs or anything like that. The writers who write science fiction and who write Star Trek are constantly trying to imagine the future, but they can't often or always get it right. So things that we now take for granted that did happen technologically hadn't happened yet, and you can tell in the book that that's true. Same thing with this. Tuvok fools the Maquis fairly easily. I mean, I'm no tech whiz, and I was looking at the steps by which they infiltrate him into Chakotay's crew and thinking, come on. Come on. This is little better than two-step identification. This would be easy to do. It would be easy to do in 2023. Imagine how much easier it would be in the 23rd century. But it's still really good. And Tuvok is perfectly in character throughout. And so is Chakotay. And so is B'Elanna Torres. So even is Seska. It's just Keith Candido's ability to write characters in character in very little space. Keep in mind the Captain DeSoto, the Hood, the Voyager, that segment, part 3 of this 4-part story, is a little more than 100 pages. There's not much space at all. And yet he is able to do it effortlessly. It is so incredible. And an important point here, an important thing that stops this from being pure fan service, is that he's just as capable of doing that with the Andorian Tharia, who's a character that he creates. He was just as capable of doing that with 2 or 3 characters in the first book that he made up. They also are completely compelling, completely three-dimensional, so that by the time you get to the 30th page of you reading them, when they enter a situation, you think, oh, this is how Tharia would deal with this. So it's not just our canonical characters, but oh my god, the canonical characters are done so well. They are done so well. It is amazing. And like the first book, when I read the first book, maybe not the Deep Space Nine parts, because that seems to be the curse of Deep Space Nine, but when I read the Matt Decker parts, when that episode was over, in the first book, Matt Decker has an adventure with Captain Kirk of the Enterprise, who's very much his junior officer, so Kirk is kind of under his control. And we get a lot of Matt Decker and his crew. At least his command crew. He doesn't seem to know all of his crew the way Kirk does, but but his command crew includes some old friends and some very interesting characters. And when that part was over, I wanted really a lot to read some more adventures of Matt Decker's ship, of that crew. They're about, for instance, when that first part ends, they're about to go on to a diplomatic summit that Matt Decker assumes will be very boring. And I wanted to follow the ship along to that because of the job that Keith Candido does, and because of how effective a job he does. When in the next page we get Jim Kirk's log entries about the loss of Matt Decker and his crew in the original Star Trek episode, oh my God, it hit harder than it ever has. I'd never put faces to that reality in that show. I've watched that episode a million times. And now I feel like I know the people who were not even named. And that was true in the second part of the first book as well. To an extent, it was. And it's true here too. Absolutely. Captain DeSoto and his crew on board the Hood. The one connection with the canonical Star Trek that we really know is that we know that Will Riker was an officer of his and left. And that DeSoto misses him. DeSoto, he's a great officer. He was a great guy. DeSoto misses having him on board. There's also a fascinating, very brief, it was over too fast for me, a fascinating reflection on DeSoto's part about the different kinds of Starfleet captains. He calls it the captain effect, where certain captains, he says the great ones, and just self-effacingly does not include himself. And you don't believe it. Especially the more you think about all the stuff that even in Star Trek canon, Captain DeSoto has done. If you can do all those things and not be a great captain, I don't know what you are. It's probably just that it's not his way. It's not his captaining style. But, for instance, when the Hood hosts a delegation from Voyager, Janeway comes over. She comes over with her first officer, who's not Chakotay, of course. Chakotay is in the story, but he's not her first officer. It's hard to beat those reflexes. And she comes over with an Officer Tuvok. And when they enter the room, DeSoto reflexively thinks that Janeway has mastered the captain trick. He calls it a trick of great captains, and he mentions Jean-Luc Picard and Janeway. And says that the captain trick is the bearing that they have that makes them the biggest person in the room, no matter who else is there. And he just matter-of-factly says that he doesn't have it, that he can't do it. It's pretty clear that he's not sure he wants to do it, so he decides to be a different kind of captain, a friendlier, low-key kind of captain. But it doesn't make him ineffective. We get very little of the Hood's adventures, even hinted at in this story. But you know from Star Trek, you know from watching Star Trek, that he's in the thick of it. In the Dominion War, probably in the war against the Kardashians, he's in the thick of it, and he doesn't die, he doesn't fail, he doesn't lose his ship. That has to be something. You have to be a certain kind of person to be a Starfleet captain in the first place. But I love that moment, because that moment, he realizes that Janeway has that thing, whatever it is, on first brush, on first impression. And then, as the scene unfolds, we get Keith Candido's characterization of Janeway, and it is perfect. This is the bun of steel Janeway, that right there. This is the first few seasons of Voyager called the bun of steel. And he gets that Janeway perfectly. Absolutely perfectly. Her combination of seeming sweetness and steel hardness is perfect. And, Keith Candido doesn't even bring this up. But his characterization very much reflects that is kind of what you would be being a woman as a Starfleet captain. That, as enlightened as the 23rd century is, that's probably still a rarity. You'd have to have a little of that inner steel to put up with the crap of your own fellow captains, much less anything else you encounter. And it's captured perfectly. Just perfectly. Oh my, there are some scenes with Jane where there aren't enough of them. Like like with the first part of The Brave and the Bold, I want 10 Star Trek Voyager novels by Keith Candido. I want The Adventures of the Hood under Captain DeSoto in War and in Peace by Keith Candido. I can't get any more than what I have here. But that's, I think, a mark of a good book, is, that you want more of it from the same author. And they have to deal with this weather phenomenon on this Cardassian outpost, and it's done really well. And it moves the plot forward. That through line about Malchus the Mighty, it moves that through line forward, which is great. We're not just visiting old friends here. Although, oh my God, there are so many old friends in these stories. Oh my God, there are so many Easter eggs for Star Trek fans. But I was being careful to note whether or not that's the main reason I was enjoying this, and it isn't. This is just really well done storytelling. And Keith Candido is right there, very unobtrusively, just like in part one, filling in the reader who doesn't remember Gulliver, doesn't remember things like that. There'll be Star Trek fans who don't remember half the characters that are name-checked in here, and he knows that, which is great. A lot of Star Trek authors who do this sort of thing don't remember that. And then we move on to the fourth part, and the fourth part is telepathy. It's the telepathic item. And it's, of course, a thing that controls people's minds. That's going to be the climax of the whole story. And it is. And the slight, if it was a slight narrative problem in the earlier parts, to haul in these minor characters as guest stars, so Gulliver or one particular Klingon commander that oddly is not that Klingon commander. I mean, I recognize that Klingon commander and that actor, but it's a different, I don't know, maybe production didn't talk to the author or anything, but the Klingon commander who was brought in and his father, they are characters who have appeared in on screen in Star Trek, and a whole bunch of other people. And the problem that you would have with that is that they aren't major canonical characters. Janeway is, but her ship is disabled. It's DeSoto who has the bulk of the action. And that isn't a problem because D. Candido is such a fantastic Star Trek writer. But it might have fans hankering for bigger names to start walking in and stealing the limelight. And in the fourth part of this book, those bigger names are two characters called, what was it again? Oh yeah, Dr. McCoy and Mr. Spock. they enter into things in the fourth part of this, and no, it's incredibly good. It's just incredibly good. It has the weird skill of being able to make you, in the fourth part, especially in the second half of the fourth part, you are actually on the edge of your seat. You know every detail about the fate of every one of the people you are reading at this point. And yet, you're on the edge of your seat. And also, part 4 of The Brave and the Bold gives us a scene we always wanted and never even knew we wanted, which is Mr. Spock versus Worf. I'd never even thought about it until I read this book, and then suddenly I realized, oh, yeah, okay, I'll take that. So, my Book Trek report for today is immensely positive, just immensely positive. I have my reservations about this series at every point that one of these Zalcatian artifacts is discovered. It's literally discovered under a rock. And I don't mean a mile under a rock. I mean that a picnic would have dislodged it. It's extremely unlikely that these things remained hidden for 90,000 years in the places where they are eventually found. That strikes me as extremely unlikely. And also, of course, I don't want to spoil this book because I really want, Star Trek fans who haven't read this to give it a try. Maybe you will like it less than I did. I'd be interested to see. But I loved it. And I had reservations about where those artifacts were found, how easily they were found. All 4 of them, the character that finds them literally stumbles across them. And they might be guided a little by the mental telepathy of these things, but they're still easy to find. Easy to recover. You don't need machinery to recover them. And also, the conclusion of the storyline, because of course if you have that through line running through all of these storylines about Idulak and Malchus the Mighty and the Zalcatian Union and all, the wrap-up of that storyline is a little bit easy. I didn't detract from the book because it was such a joy to see these characters. I kind of wish that Captain DeSoto were in Picard's place there, except that I guess the general reader that the publisher was worried that they would lose. I guess the general reader would look at Captain DeSoto up there and say, "Well, who the hell is that?" But, anyway, the joy of watching these characters be so fully realized. I mean, we do meet Captain DeSoto at different points in Star Trek, but we don't know anything about him. So really, DeCandido is fleshing him out just from the drawing board, and it works. It very much works. So that was a joy. I did, after all, weaken and go back to part 2 of The Brave and the Bold, but it was a joy. It was well worth it. So I'm going to spin the wheel again tonight and add another Star Trek book. And we will see. This is a high point. I'd be surprised if I pick anything at random that's better than this in the month of June. But we have a lot more book trek to go. so who knows? But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.